Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. Every company has a story to tell, from the small startup to the large enterprise, and everything in between. This is one of them. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Marco.
Sean.
When was the last time you roamed and played with dinosaurs?
Oh man, dinosaurs been a while because the last few times I went to a museum was in Florence, and we really don't deal much with dinosaurs there. A lot of art, but no dinosaurs. So I need to go to a natural science. Are you thinking about a night at the museum or something like that?
That's right, exactly. Where you bring your own. You bring your
own dinosaur,
and you ride the pterodactyl around. I don't know. There seems to be a movie that's similar to that at the moment as well.
Yeah.
But if you think about the museum, it's all about these precious things that have been, created at one point, collected at another, and are being shared with us, thankfully, by those who want to preserve them and give back to society. And there's a lot that goes on there, right, Marco?
There is a lot, and if you're bringing me to a museum like natural science, I want to touch stuff. I want to touch the dinosaur, the T-Rex, and everything, and I'm not sure they're going to allow me to do so. But there are,
if you have the right pass, maybe.
I don't know. I think even with the right pass, unless you're like an expert, they're not going to let you touch it, and it's certainly not without gloves. But there are other things you can experience, and still doing that into a really safe and secure environment. And we're taking all this wide angle here because that's the idea we came up with the creative for this conversation with a good friend of ours, Sean. You want to introduce him? You want to invite him at the museum?
Let's take a trip to the museum with our good friend Terry Ray from Imperva. Terry, it's good to have you on again.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Marco. It's always happy to be back, and I enjoy museums like everybody else.
There you go. Good, because we're going to talk about that today. Sort of.
We're going to beat that dinosaur to a pulp, I think. But let's. We've had many conversations with you and others from Imperva talking about network security and application security and data security and privacy most recently as well. And the reason I went with the dinosaur, museums can house many things, but I went with the dinosaurs because I feel in some ways businesses operate like dinosaurs, especially when it comes to their data and managing access to that. And so today we're going to be talking about how to hopefully adequately secure data within the business in a way that the business can continue to extract value from the information they have. And before we get there, though, Terry, for those who haven't heard some of the previous episodes and don't know who Terry is, a quick overview of your role there at Imperva and why this topic is so important right now.
Yeah, sure. I joined Imperva back in 2002, and the whole mandate was let's protect data. At the time, it was also applications, as you said, right? You've had lots of conversations here on various facets there around it, but really what it comes down to is about paths to data. And it's why I tend to have these conversations, is because I've been doing it since 2002. So I guess we're going on 20 years now of just focusing my time, my effort, my view, and my conversations with customers and potential customers and personalities and things like that, like yourselves, just in the area of what I think is most important to organizations, and what I think they think is most important, which is the data, or the valuable asset that they tend to have, regardless of what their business is.
So let's kick it in right away, Terry, because we already brought a ton of metaphor to the table. And I remember even the past conversation, we're definitely not short of creative ideas on how to present the things that we want to talk about. But I think the most important thing right now is to start with what Sean just said. I mean, are really the businesses the dinosaurs? Or let's put it this way, what are the main obstacle and and challenges that they face when it comes down to data?
Sure. When it comes to data, when it comes to that thing that every organization wants from all of us, if it's your checking out, they want your credit card number, your name, your address, billing address, all that kind of stuff. Everybody's always gathering data. If you're like me, you're trying to do a home equity loan, then they want everything about you, your whatever it is, but all of your financial information. If you're a doctor, then of course they want very different types of information. But at the end of the day, when we think about protecting data, when I think about what you need to do around data, really it comes down to seeing and having eyes on the data, right? It's the same thing. You use the example of the museum, right? I need to understand if I'm going to protect a piece of art, if I'm going to protect a Fabergé egg or a dinosaur tooth or whatever it is, I can't do that unless I have somebody watching what's going on in the environment. I know I have to share it. That's my whole business, is sharing these lovely things with everybody who walks through my doors. But I have to do it in a way where I can make certain that the right things are happening, the right policies and controls are in place. There's a fence around it in case somebody like Marco wants to go in there and touch that dinosaur tooth, because he's got to touch everything. There's glass in front of the Mona Lisa and a number of other things that happen. That's all the important stuff. And that's the most critical thing I find that you have to begin with. You have to begin with visibility. And that's the challenge that organizations have had over years, is that so many organizations take data security as a priority, but they only prioritize those things that they are told are important. For example, if I use credit cards, then credit cards are important to me. All of the rest of my data might kind of be important to me, but really credit cards are the only thing I'm going to get a fine if I don't protect. Everything else, it'll be a bad day, but at least I'm not going to get fined. So what happens? A lot of organizations will put the controls on where they know they're going to have an issue on those assets. If I bring it back to that museum idea, I need to put protection not just on those assets that I have out in the halls, but I took my kids to France earlier this year. We went to the Louvre, and I don't know what the statistic is, but I think it's somewhere to 60 to 80% of all of the assets in the Louvre actually aren't out. But if you don't think they don't have security on all of those assets wherever they're being stored, I think you're probably wrong. I'm certain they have security across all of the assets they have, regardless of whether you happen to be walking by and looking at it or not. And that's not the same that's the same as you would see in an organization that says, you know what, credit cards are really all I care about, so that's what I'm going to secure. The rest of my environment can be the Wild West, don't care. And that's what we see in a lot of cases, is that dichotomy between what is critical to the organization in their opinion and everything else, and they only secure what they think is actually important.
And I'm gonna stick with this for a bit, because as you're describing the museum having assets that aren't on display, they're in the dark dungeons underneath the Louvre or wherever they are. I'm just thinking about business information. The first thing that came to mind was a retail operation where certain types of data and interactions and transactions look a certain way during the holiday season, and they change during the summer for back to school. And I guess my point is that there's different types of information, different types of metadata, different types of customers, perhaps, and all that context changes, right? Now, this may not be the exact parallel for a museum example, but my point is data looks different situations, different times, and I think organizations struggle with some of that as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, the way data is used, if I had to put it in two big buckets, data is used by the users, right? Your customers, if you will. I mean, let's assume it's retail, right? So your customers that are going in, they're going to go in through something that should be really understandable and repetitive. They're going to go in through your application. It does the same thing every day. Looks at things, finds things, buys things. Looks at things, finds things, buys things. They may use APIs and other pieces that sit out front because maybe they use their phone or they use a laptop or they use something else. But at the end of the day, to the repository of data in the back end where all that data sits, the applications are actually always the same. They may be a little busier or a little less busy depending on the season, but what they do and how they do it is pretty much always the same. Now, that's not necessarily the case when you look at the back end of the other bucket of people and things, which are your your DBAs. The actual managers of the data repository. And sometimes you even have business partners that might want some of that information. Maybe a little less so in a retail, but imagine manufacturing and all the B2B stuff that comes into it, or healthcare.
I'm thinking supply chain. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So all of those pieces that go in, but it's all that back end stuff that you have some level of implied trust with, that you might feel, I feel comfortable about those folks because I know who they are. Don't I know who they are? Well, the reality is you have no idea who they are. All you know is it's company XYZ, and who's on the other end of that usually don't have a big idea. The point is that level of it can actually change quite a bit on the back end as you have your own employees come and go, DBAs or database administrators or otherwise. You have consultants that come in and do a lot of that work. Maybe you have managed services and others. And of course, your partners, as I said, who do they have coming in that are consultants and their employees coming and going and other things? So we've seen examples of breaches before. I won't name company names, but we've seen examples of breaches before where companies get attacked through portals that are trusted business partners, whether it's an HVAC portal or whether it's a points portal or something else, depending on your business. And that's the change that I see happening quite frequently, is that back end area. Yet at the same time, so many businesses, as you mentioned earlier, have really invested in protecting that front end piece, web application firewalls, network firewalls, intrusion prevention, all of these things. Pretty much the perimeter, that front end piece of applications and APIs that frankly are the easier and less changing element of what accesses your data, is pretty well protected these days if you've got the right technology. The back end is where it's still a bit of the Wild West, because organizations just haven't really prioritized it. And it's a little bit, my wife is a doctor, right? So it's a little bit of a blood-brain barrier, right? Between the two, nothing will ever, pass, if you will, in many cases. And that if I'm a security engineer, I probably don't have a lot of experience in managing databases. If I'm a database administrator or engineer, I probably don't have a lot of experience in the understanding of security and the risks and consequences of security around data across all my data stores. And this is kind of the difference between what you see in the application and network world and security. They kind of all fit together. This database has always been a little bit of an outlier for everyone else. And that's that challenge of organizations to be able to bring those two functions together, security and the data owners, data security, to say, we need to work together to make certain that we can see everything, understand everything in this tier of the organization. And the technology certainly exists to do all of that, but the wherewithal, the driver, the cost can, of course, get high up there as well, if there's not constant drivers behind it. And I'll leave you one last point. One of the drivers behind that is, of course, things like regulatory compliance. And that's why they come about.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I kept going back to compliance, and that's often the way that the controls are derived, I guess, and then deployed. And sometimes we miss the mark with that, based on what's really going on within the business. Focusing on the control to meet compliance may not actually address the risk. And I want to get into kind of this insider threat view a bit, the DBA versus the IT admin versus the security admin or engineer. And I don't know if I chose versus there purposefully or not, but maybe it probably seems like that to them. And I guess how do organizations, because the other word you used was visibility. And I'm wondering how organizations can get visibility across those different roles. What are you seeing when you talk to customers, and how are they talking about it? And And how are you helping them get that visibility to overcome some of these challenges of the versus between the different teams?
I'll admit, traditionally, the vendors, ourselves and others, were partially at fault for this gap, and the customers were also a bit at fault for it, in the gap itself, right? So as I said earlier, right, the customers would say, let's just do what we have to. I need to be PCI, therefore I have some PCI servers. Let's protect those. I pick on PCI, but it could be any regulation. But I'm going to pick on these. I'm going to cover these PCI servers, and that's all I'm going to do because everything else doesn't matter. But there's another reason why they would do that, and that's kind of on the vendors traditionally. The vendors, the technology behind data security to gather that data to gain that visibility meant that the vendor technology needed to be able to gather all of the activity that's happening in a large number of databases and bring that activity all into one place so that an organization could answer questions, do threat detection, incident response, and all of those things that security needs to do for the entire organization. What it meant was that the organization, the vendors themselves, needed to have technology that was scalable enough, modern enough, if you will, to be able to keep up with the modern technology that businesses were using. So giving you an example, right? So if I've got a business that has 100 modern databases that can move data and accept data very, very fast, I, as a vendor, need to be able to bring the logs from all of that activity into my system equally as efficient, if not better, and without more efficiency. Meaning, if I've got 100 databases at an organization, the organization does not want to buy 100 things from me or any other vendor to go protect their 100 things. It can't be a 1-to-1 ratio. They want to really kind of look for one thing to protect everything. And that's really been the goal of data security for many years, but it's been 2 decades and we're only kind of just here now. And that's where we are today, right? So that's how we're helping organizations today, is to say visibility, the need for visibility has not changed. You still need to be able to see what you're doing. It'd be wonderful. I know we use a lot of analogies here, but it would be wonderful if we were all a Jedi and I could block lasers with my eyes closed and a blast shield down. That would be wonderful. The reality is we aren't. So we have to have our eyes open. I have to watch everything. And that's really where the technology has come to today. So today, now what you see is what used to be called data activity monitoring, or database activity monitoring was the acronym that you might use. Now today, what you see analysts and people like ourselves talking about is data security platforms. And it's a platform that has that capacity, that has been reimagined. If I could rebuild data security today, it would become this hyper scalable, horizontally scalable, infinite storage platform that says, we don't care how much data you have, how much volume you have, we can bring that in. And rather than a 1-to-1 or 1-to-10 ratio of how many things a customer might have, now it's a 400-to-1 type of system. So it really has gotten to that point where it's easy for an organization to say, I really can monitor everything. I really can see everything. And if I can see everything, then ultimately I can protect everything.
And when you say everything, Terry, I'm thinking back to early days when I was building a SIM, and we had, I'll just say it, agents sitting on a bunch of things. Maybe they're remote sitting on things, but still things connecting to other things to collect logs. And it's whatever the log had, that's what we collected, and we folded it in and prayed that there was some connection there as we began to aggregate and correlate all these data points. So when you say everything, I'm wondering, has that world changed from a data security perspective, connecting to databases? Are we logging the right things? Are we providing the right interfaces to get the information we need from a security perspective? Or are we still limited to, give me what you have and I'll pray that I have what I need to do what I need to do to protect that information?
Yeah. So let's go back to the museum idea, right? So museums have all kinds of fun stuff and things in them, lasers we see on TV and all that kind of stuff when people aren't there and all that. But the one thing museums certainly have a lot of are a lot of cameras. And I equate the cameras that are wired, that have to run wires everywhere. I can imagine the difficulty of running wires in new buildings, much less really old buildings, which are typically museums. So trying to limit the visibility that you can get from a device that has to be connected to another device does limit the visibility. And if I bring that back to data security, that visibility was things like agents. In the past, we had to deploy, we being this industry of data security, to really be able to see what's happening on a database. We needed to install an agent on the database, and that agent would do all the work. Because for me to ask a database to turn on the logs for a database, it's kind of like asking a Cisco router, if you're a network person, to just turn on all of the Cisco logging and just leave it on all the time so we can put it somewhere. It crushes the performance of the Cisco router, just like, and I'm picking on Cisco here, but any router. But it would do the same thing to a database if it's an older database. So agents had their place and still have their place. Wired cameras, if you will, still have their place where it makes sense, where there are older systems and that technology is already there. We can go look at mainframe and AS400 and old versions of other databases, and we would do that with an agent. But nowadays, there's also managed databases, cloud databases, new modern databases in the cloud, Snowflake, and all of those sorts of things. All of them have the ability to turn on logs and look at everything and yet not really impact the database. So the message here, and the point is, the vendor technology, our vendor technology, has really kept up with that to say, we recognize there's a long tail of legacy platforms that an organization might say, I still have a lot of old stuff and I still need to monitor it. If I'm going to monitor everything, if I'm going to look at everything, I still have to include all that. That's great. And we have an agent for all of that, and we can still do all of that. But at the same time, that organization is certainly at least partially modernized. And for anything that's modern, you don't need an agent. So we go wireless cameras. Let's put those cameras all over the place wherever I want to, whenever I need them, and give me more visibility wherever I need to, and it doesn't impact anything. Same thing here in the database space. I can go and put in monitor it agentlessly, just pull the logs back from those data stores because they can log to their heart's content and fill up our system with all of the activity. What the resulting results are is that we ultimately get full visibility, whether your databases are old or new, whether they're in the cloud or on-prem. And frankly, even since the last time we talked, it's not just about databases. It's also about file servers and S3 buckets in the cloud and on-prem and all of this. Being able to have all of that in one place means that you can now ask a question and be guaranteed you're going to get an answer back. What did Terry do in my data? And I just don't want to have to worry about, was it in the cloud or on-prem or old or new? Just tell me everything Terry touched over the last 30 days because something happened and for some reason I'm looking at his behavior and I want to go see everything. And I don't want to have to go to 2 different places to find it and also find out that I couldn't detect or didn't have logging turned on to part of it because I didn't have a camera in that room. And that becomes a problem for me.
Yeah, and Terry, while we were talking to prepare for this conversation, I remember we spent quite some time into looking at the bank system, and I feel like we've gone back to when the bank were just like easy to rob with, horses and pulling out the the windows and get inside, but you didn't have camera at the time. But we went a long way. I mean, we started our metaphor with cameras in the street of London, for example, and then from there we thought about a glass box with the bank. But the issue with that is always that you brought up is when you learn about this, you look at the past. You're not preventing anymore. You're just trying to see what happened back in time, right? But the goal is to kind of be able to get on it when something do happen. So I remember you brought the example of the museum with the security guard that is sitting there. So I'm thinking like now with artificial intelligence and new technology, if you put your futurist hat on, number one, are we much better placed than what we were, 10 years, 20 years ago? I'm not going to go, in the 1800, but, and what do you think is next? How is Imperva addressing the future of security?
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, the majority of the users, when you get close to the data, become very nervous when you start using words like prevention and blocking. And this is a core asset for them. And even though they have blocking all already configured at their network firewall and web application firewalls and all of that, as soon as you get to the back end at that data store, being able to actually be able to say, I want to stop somebody from doing something, becomes a very different, sometimes a more difficult conversation. I will tell you, that's coming up more and more frequently today. It has come up in the past, and it has been a factor in the past where customers have wanted to block. In fact, there have been some requirements on customers being able to block. There is the ability to do real-time monitoring and blocking of data. That's certainly there. It's just not as common because of organizations having a little bit of a fear as you get closer and closer to their most critical asset. So the reality here is the future of this is to get even closer and closer to real time, while also being agentless. And the reason I say it that way is to be real time, it means that I can't, to your point, I can't just be collecting logs from somebody to be real time, because clearly that's after the logs have come in. But using an agent or even using other technology, there are ways that we can either get between the user and the data, or there are ways that we can actually, for very critical types of data, we can actually have a store and forward mechanism where you don't get to the data until we verify that you actually are supposed to get to that data. Then we will let you get there. So a little bit of a security gate, if you will, before people get there. And I'm simplifying it. But fact is the technology does exist to be able to either be real time, be able to block, or what is more common, and when I mean more common, I would say 95% of users more common, is after the fact is actually okay. And after the fact is actually generally okay, and actually in a lot of museums as well, in that, you can touch the dinosaur, because the reality is they got a guard, they're going to pull you out of there, but you might not do that much damage. In a business, that is quite a bit different. And I think that's the future of where they go, is businesses say, it's not okay for you to touch our dinosaur. It's not okay for you to touch my data in an inappropriate way. I need you to only be able to do what you're supposed to. And I need closer to real time. And that's a lot of the work that we're working on, is how close to real time can we get while still maintaining the simplicity of agentless, and not requiring things like agents and things in the middle of the technology, which we would require today if you really wanted to be real time. That's the future of this, is really going into that world.
Sounds like the force is the solution. I mean, right?
Could be with you. Well, I'm not gonna let you simplify it too much. I want you to get into some of the weeds here, Terry, because as I was thinking about this a little bit before we started. I know there was a mention in some of the preparation around open banking, and I'm very into the healthcare space and the health information exchanges. And both of those, and I'm sure there are many other examples we can draw upon, but both of those kind of point back to something we touched on earlier, where there's an ecosystem of systems and APIs and vendors and people and users that ultimately determine how and when information should be stored, used, accessed, manipulated. And I'm just wondering, how do we prepare for that? Now, it sounds like agentless and sitting in the middle between all this stuff is a good way to go. But how do we get to a point where those systems can operate in a way where the data is useful? Right, we're not stopping the data because, oh, you've left our firewall, you've left our perimeter, or whatever that line is. So it's still useful, but still safe, right?
Yeah.
So the dinosaur is on the move, but we still want to protect it.
Well, it is that ecosystem, right? I mean, you bring up the right word, right? So it is the ecosystem that comes in. There's no one technology that's just going to say, I do it all, right? So if you look at, let's look at a healthcare, right? So healthcare is doing more and more, to your point, of information exchange and others. I'm intimately involved with a number of different pieces right here, particularly around electronic medical records, electronic healthcare systems, and all of that. The fast healthcare interoperability acts that are going on with APIs and the certification of APIs and all of that. So when you look at the right reference architecture, for example, of what needs to happen when it comes down to data. Well, there's the regulatory compliance that says there's some very specific things you need to do, and then there's best practice that you also need to do to not be negligent, right? So they're very specific, and then they kind of open it to a little more nebulous commonality to be able to say, just do the right things. We're not going to define what they all are. And a lot of regulations will do that. And then there's things like NIST and the frameworks for security that will come out and say, hey, explicitly, here's the things you need to have in place. You need to have a network firewall. So let's talk about network access control. You need to have a web application firewall, API, I'm going to lump them all together, right? But web application firewall, API security, anti-DDoS, anti-bot. Usually those are all kind of coming packaged in different flavors, et cetera. We have one, of course, that sits out there. That has to be there to be able to protect, as I said, that repetitive action front end, those APIs and applications that in terms of your data do the same thing every single day. They allow patients to see records, allow doctors to talk to patients, all of that sort of stuff. It's not easy, but in terms of data security, it's a really good front end and first step to be able to make certain that the applications are at least doing the repetitive things they're supposed to versus repetitive things they're not supposed to. And then, of course, there's things like identity access management to make sure that Terry really is Terry. And if you want to go deeper into identity access management, there's also encryption, which, in my opinion, encryption is essentially identity access management. If you're allowed to see the data, then yes, you're allowed to see the data. If you're Terry, you can see it. If you're not Terry, you can't. But those two pieces go together. It's that last piece, that last mile, that's the other piece there, which is that ability to say, all right, now we've prevented all the normal behavior, all of the repetitive behavior. We make sure that the network access is all completely accurate. Our APIs are secured out front. They might be FHIR APIs, but they're still being secured by a web application firewall. Now in the back end is when I need to have that true visibility and security. And what am I securing back here? In the back end, I still need to monitor all of the things I think I have closed. I still need to know when my apps touch my systems. I still need to know when my APIs touch my systems, because that's critical, because I need to be able to compare when Terry accesses data. When Terry goes in and accesses a set of data, I need to know, does Terry normally access that data? And that's okay for me to just compare Terry to himself, but who's to say that Terry's not normally accessing data where he's the only one, the only human who accesses that data? All of his peers, they never touch that data. Instead, only the application and APIs are the only other thing that accesses that data. And then Terry goes in there and he touches that data, and he's doing it every single day. What makes Terry so special about him being able to touch that application and API data when none of his peers are doing it? That should be a red flag that kind of bubbles up. He's not doing what his peers are doing. He's doing something different. This is the behavioral piece that kind of comes into what you put on top of visibility. So as I said, visibility is the key. You have to have visibility on all of it. But once you have visibility, now you can really do interesting things with analytics and machine learning and start to learn about the behaviors of the users of your data, particularly in the back end when they're not doing the same thing every day, and compare that to those systems doing the same thing, those people doing different things, and those outliers start to pop up routinely where you can start to find exactly those people, those applications, those APIs, and those other things that are just doing something a little bit different, and likely something against policy, something against regulation, or in some cases, they're just trying to do something good for the company and not knowing any better, and yet exposing the company to risk. Taking a database, a complete export of their database, taking it home for the weekend because they're going to optimize the database and bring it back. Well, lo and behold, their data gets stolen because they took it home over the weekend. They shouldn't have taken that export in the first place. Nobody else ever does. And that to me, that's the business side of this. When you start to really drill down and deep into it, what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to prevent unusual, anomalous, and certainly bad behavior on your data. But there are all of these pieces of ecosystem that have to come into it. I need to know that my apps are safe and what my apps are doing. So I need to watch that data. I need to know whether a particular user is being shared by multiple other users and whether there's risky behavior in all of that. I need to be able to leverage that information and send that out to something like a ServiceNow, so my SOC engineers who aren't database security experts can get access to it, or Splunk, so those people can get access to it. All of that ecosystem is critically important when it comes to a data security platform, which is why you'll see data security platforms effectively saying, we really don't care what the source of data is. We want as much context as possible. And I'll leave you with one last example. Even at Imperva, we will bring in our own data from everything we've collected, but we'll bring in our competitors' data too. If you have our competitor, awesome, that's great. You've got a data source, bring that data in too, because it's about the intelligence, the context, and all of that comes into it. The source just really shouldn't matter. It's about being able to be smarter and build more information into a machine learning model so that we can really leverage machine learning and analytics the way they're supposed to be built, versus going back to the world of, I'm just going to monitor 2 servers. There's nothing I'm going to learn from machine learning in that. There's no analytics that I can build because it's just 2 servers. It's not enough.
Well, I want to use the last few minutes here to even dig a little bit more into that. Like, if you could bring a couple of case studies of how Imperva gets in according to what the businesses or the industry is, because as you mentioned a few times, not all the data are using the same way, and not all the business are going to need either the same amount or the same quality, or even access the data as much as others. So yeah, maybe a couple of case studies if you can.
Yeah, so I've got one. One of my favorite stories. So it is about Texas. I can't tell you who it is. I'll just tell you that they control some of the roads around here. And one of the great stories that we had here was that they were able to look at different types of vehicles and private information about those vehicles as they flow through different areas on the roads. It's a toll road, right? So being able to see different kinds of toll roads through the system. Well, being able to understand the data for this organization meant that what they could do is they could say, all right, well, there's parts of the data that I store. And the parts of that data that I store is actually data that really only law enforcement really needs to know about. And then by policy, really law enforcement was the only person that's supposed to see that data. But really what ultimately happened was other people within the organization had to manage that data. They have to manage the data that sits in the back end, but they aren't actually supposed to look at that data at all. And so what ultimately happened was, by putting in the analytics and giving the visibility and being able to see all the information, what they learned is they learned, number one, that they didn't predict by creating policies, actual policies in the product to determine these things. They had corporate policies, but they didn't have physical policies that said Terry can see this data and Adam cannot. It's just something they understood wasn't supposed to happen. Instead, what they found was, after looking at the data, in fact, they did have some of their users looking at this data, not just managing the data, but looking at and using the data that were really only law enforcement was supposed to see. It was a violation of that policy. And at the end of the day, what they found was that these users were kind of tracking their significant others and making certain that if they said they went to the mall, yes, they in fact went to the mall, or they went whatever. It was a poor use of their access, and certainly, and I'm sure there was some consequences for that. But the fact is it gave this organization that ability to be able to say, hey, look, we now see information we had no idea was going on. We knew it wasn't supposed to happen. It was a very particular use case, and this needed to happen. And the same thing is true. I want to take you to healthcare for a second. This exact same thing exists in healthcare when you think about electronic healthcare systems. A lot of electronic healthcare systems that are out there, the platforms that hospitals use, a lot of times are implicitly trusted and aren't really looked at in the back end. But when you start looking at them in the back end, you actually start to find and have the ability now to answer when someone like a regulator comes in and says, do you know who's accessing your private data? You can see, yes, I really do know who's accessing my private data. I say it that way because most providers out there today, in fact, don't have that visibility into their most critical asset, which is their electronic medical record system or their EHR system. They have it in the rest of their systems, but that one has always just kind of remained over on its own. And we're trying to close that gap as well. It's all of those kind of gaps where we go into an organization and we talk about what's critical to you. This area is critical. Great. What about all the rest of it? Why is the rest of it not critical? And that's the work that we do with the organizations, is to talk about how do we get that visibility into the rest of that organization to make certain that someone can really see everything?
Yeah, and I want to keep you there for a moment, Terry, as we get close to wrapping here. But just this idea, because you mentioned behavior earlier, and I wanted to maybe touch on that a little bit more as part of what you were just describing. Because it's not just user behavior; it's not just identity, right? This person does something, and they are who they say they are, and they have the right to do what they're doing, and it makes sense for the business that they're doing that at the time and rate that they're doing it. But there are, you mentioned APIs and applications. There are systems that connect together, certainly in healthcare exchange and in open banking and other things we talked about here today. And it's that broader view of behavior that I think is really important. And you kind of touched on it in a couple of your examples, but how do you and how does your team help organizations kind of grab that big view of, this is what our business looks like, here's how it runs, this is the behavior we expect between our people and systems and applications and the full ecosystem? And then certainly there's technology that you provide and partners that you work with to kind of meet the other side of it, but there's that middle piece as well that says, this is what we expect it to do, here are the controls that we have in place or policies, and then we map the technology to that. How do you and your team get involved in that to ensure that full set of processes is done properly?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked the question, because every organization is a little bit different. A lot of organizations are a lot different, right? But usually what we begin with is a conversation around the driver behind the original discussion of why are we here? I would say that the majority of organizations that bring us in first and foremost because they were told they had to because of compliance. That's got to be the greatest driver of data security beyond anything else. The next closest is an organization had a breach, and so the immediate reaction is talk about all the things we can do not to have this happen again. And that usually only lasts for a few months. But the good staying factor of general data security is regulatory compliance. And you could say it might be a cart before the horse kind of thing. But you could argue that regulatory compliance only exists with regard to data because there are so many breaches. But then you might say that organizations really only apply their security in place for breaches only because regulatory compliance tells them to do so. There's this whole interaction between regulatory compliance, security, and what organizations need to do. Some of them do it, some of them don't. Some of them still get breached and get exposed anyway. So that's the first conversation that we have. The first conversation that we have is around, why are we here? And from that conversation, it helps us lead into the conversations that we'll have about, okay, let's assume that conversation is about regulatory compliance. Great. So we understand your regulation is XYZ, GDPR, HIPAA, PCI, PIPEDA, whatever it happens to be. It's privacy or industry related, whatever. When I hear HIPAA, I start to say, okay, well then here's the things you're going to need to do. I know for sure you need to be able to track all access to patient data. And patient data is all of these 18 different things defined by HIPAA. So here's all the things we need to track. We need to go find that data, and this is the process of doing it. You need to answer these questions, and we need to know when these bad things happen on that data. You need to know about it, and we'll send that over to a security operating center that will track that down and do instant response. The same thing is true even if they say, okay, this is security, just general best practice security. Well, then there's a process that we'll go through. So it's a consultative practice that we would go through. We would either use our consultants that we have, our professional services and organizations, or we would leverage our partners out there in the wild that would go out there and do that work. But because every organization interprets regulatory compliance a little bit different, there's always going to be these baselines of these are the things that need to get done so you understand the risk associated with your business, where your business is against that piece of regulatory compliance, and what you need to do next. And then even though there's that well understood set of things that need to happen, then every organization has their auditor, internal or external or otherwise, that has their own flavor of the other things they're going to ask. And I'll use you an example of FFIEC compliance. So I talked with one financial services organization. I asked them, how important is FFIEC compliance with regard to your security program? And the organization said, honestly, we look at it once a year, kind of run down some check marks. And if we looks like we kind of have everything, we're good. I asked another one about FFIEC compliance, and they said, our auditor, we have to be very, very careful with our auditor, because if we dig in too far into the interface and show them too much, then they start to ask many, many, many other questions. And so we try to give them just exactly what they're looking for, and nothing else, because we don't want to open up a can of worms and have them dig in. So even with regard to one particular set of compliance, two organizations have two very different experiences in terms of what it means to their business and how they go about achieving compliance or achieving, a comfort level in the business with regard to data security in it. And that's kind of what I see is it's always a discussion about what the customer needs to see from the technology to get them what they need to solve audit gaps, to solve security gaps, and to solve whatever gap that they brought us in for.
It's good you're there, because all I want to do is look at the dinosaurs. I don't want to worry about any of that stuff.
Yeah, that's something that you must do. But sometimes, especially if you're working with the dinosaurs, that's really, you need to. If you're a paleontologist, you need to access it, but still keep it safe. So I think that's the thing. And Terry, I remember you say it's not that we don't trust you; it's that we don't. Right.
So we just don't trust. That's all.
That's it. That's that. I'll rest my case right here. Now, seriously, great conversation. Always entertaining and is extremely educational. So I hope that our audience took a lot of good point here. Sean, always exciting.
I know. I mean, there's so much here, and I mean, just with the advancements in technology and the interaction with so many people, and the amount of data. I mean, I was joking a bit of how complex it can be, but I mean, if you don't start with a view for what the outcome is that you want to achieve, chances are a scramble is waiting for you, a bunch of chaos. So I think taking an approach up front that says, here's how we run our business, here's how our data is used, and here's why it's important, why we need to protect it, and all the places that it goes that needs to be protected. I think you have a better chance to eliminate some of the chaos and achieve the outcomes that you want. And Terry, I'm grateful for you to bring so many good examples, and hopefully the audience takes some good notes here and connect with you to help them with some of those early steps and throughout the process to help them protect their data. And we had a couple conversations with Kate Barecchia from Imperva as well on privacy, which is, you can't talk about data without talking about privacy as well. We touched on it briefly here today. I would encourage folks to listen to those conversations too, because it's all connected at some point. So Terry, thanks for taking us to the museum and doing so safely.
Hey guys, it's always a pleasure to hang out with you guys for an hour or so I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and the story made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.